is Ron Carrico. I'm a docent at San Diego Air and Space Museum. Today we're introducing the speaker series, which is going to be a series of discussions of some of the items we have in our museum by some of our experts who have done some extensive study further than what we normally do. First will be Chuck Dorigan. He's going to discuss the Americans who aided the French in World War I. The basis of this idea is we have three major exhibits in our museum, and they're connected by their volunteers who were aiding our allies, trying to defend them when democracy was being challenged. I'm going to tell the story of the AVG, the American Volunteer Group, along with the 23rd Fighter Group. Most people miss this, but the Flying Tigers were composed of American Volunteer Group and the active Army Air Corps with the 23rd Fighter Group. Together, these are best known as the Flying Tigers. Paul Trevisan is going to discuss the CNAC with a little help from Lou Zhang, who's going to explain the bloodshed that was the common denominator between the AVG, the 23rd Fighter Group, Flying Tigers, and the CNAC, the Chinese National Air Corporation. Bruce Allen is going to discuss the Eagle Squadrons, which was made up primarily of American pilots who were flying with the RAF in the very early part of the Second World War, trying to defend the skies, defend Britain over the skies of the English Channel in Germany and England. Chuck Dorigan is going to speak first.
All right, my name is Chuck Dorigan. I'm a docent here at the San Diego Air and Space Museum, and it's my pleasure to talk this morning about the Lafayette Flying Corps and the Lafayette Escadrille. Storage units were very important in our history of aviation. Sometimes people get kind of confused as to the difference between the Flying Corps and the Escadrille. What it was that the Lafayette Flying Corps is a collective name of all the people who flew for France in World War I before we got into the war later on. The Lafayette Escadrille is a special unit within the Flying Corps that was comprised over time, over 2 years, of 38 Americans. It was the only all-American unit in the volunteer group in France. So World War I was truly the first global war. We fought basically in Europe, all through the Middle East, in the Pacific, China, and the Atlantic. Important dates for us were the 3rd and the 4th of August, 1914, when France, England, Germany all declared war upon each other, and that began the influx of people to France to help with the war. The U.S. declared war on Germany in April of 1917, and in 1918 was the first U.S. service unit. In November of 1918, the war ended. The time between the 3rd of August, the time between this August and 18 February was basically the time in which the volunteers were the ones who flew for France. 1918 is when everything transitioned into the Lafayette Escadrille going into the U.S. Air Service and Americans transferring to the U.S. Air Service. Okay, next. When the Americans came over, there were a number of ways to get into the French Air Service. Basically, at first, going through the Foreign Legion or becoming an ambulance driver was one of the primary ways of doing it. Other people could apply directly to the French Air Service. This is a picture of Kiffin and Paul Rockwell. Kiffin Rockwell was in the Foreign Legion. His brother Paul didn't serve in the Lafayette Escadrille, but Kiffin would. And what Kiffin would do eventually would be the first person, he'd be the first American to shoot down a German aircraft. So he came in through the Foreign Legion. We'll see Kiffin later on in the talk. Here's the ambulance service way, in which people got came through the ambulance service and then applied to the air service to become pilots. Next, we'll see how they trained. Next, when they did get into the air service, they trained for about 6 to 9 months. They started out flying in the Blériot monoplane, which is kind of also a storied airplane in aviation history, kind of a sleeper. first to fly across the English Channel, was also the first one to serve in war as a reconnaissance airplane 2 years before World War I began. It flew for the Italians when the Italians were fighting the Ottoman Turks in Africa. The Blériot was a reconnaissance aircraft flying in that war. So it's one of the first airplanes to fly in war. And then in World War I, what it did is it flew early on as a reconnaissance aircraft. They also use it for a trainer. Here it is as what they call the penguin, where they would cut off the wings of the aircraft, the outer part of the wings, and they would use this aircraft as an airplane to train people to control the aircraft on the ground. And then, as I said, it also was used for reconnaissance. One more thing about it is, one in New York and one in England are the oldest two airworthy aircraft in existence, still flying. Next, when the students graduated it took about 6 to 9 months to get through the flying training. When the students graduated to their units, there were about 92 units spread across France and down into Switzerland. When they got into their units, they flew aircraft that had airspeeds from 16 to 135 miles an hour. They often did they flew Newports, Spads, different kinds of aircraft, and they also flew some of the Blériots and the early reconnaissance. They often flew patrols at 15,000 feet or higher. They had reconnaissance aircraft that would go up over 20,000 feet. Now, these aircraft had oxygen tubes. People could breathe through an oxygen tube, or they developed oxygen masks. When these people flew, the French would often fly patrols. When they would fly their patrols, they would often fly at 3 levels. They would fly low level, 4, 5, 6,000 feet, up about 10, 12,000 feet, and then way up, 15 or 16,000 feet. So they're up there in essentially hypoxic regions. They're getting cold. They would say that it was like they would have a hard time even charging their guns because of the lack of oxygen. They would get tired up there flying around like it. It'd be very cold. And they said their fingers, it felt like they had bananas in their gloves trying to work with their guns in other parts of the aircraft. And also, one thing is they would say that they had a terrible time with their bladder. They didn't have a way to relieve themselves. Next. Well, I was going to say that they didn't use parachutes when they flew at these altitudes. If you were to be shot up and hopefully not catch fire, but if you did catch fire, the only thing you could do is try to get down to the ground. Now, the airplanes they flew, we have several airplanes we're going to show that they flew. All of these airplanes are here in our museum, either as reproductions or originals. And this is the Newport 11. The Newport 11 was the aircraft that was the first aircraft, one of the first aircraft early in the Lafayette Escadrille, Lafayette Flying Corps time. Did about 100 miles an hour, could go up to about 16 or 17,000 feet. It had a 30 caliber British 303 30 caliber Lewis gun that had either a 47 or a 97 round magazine on top. And what they had to do when they were going to charge that, reload that, is pull the gun down a little bit, kind of keep the airplane flying with their kind of knees on a control stick. Put the canister back on the gun, and then set it back up. And they could fire the gun from inside the aircraft. This was the aircraft that kind of overcame what was called the Fokker scourge. The Fokker Eindecker was an airplane that the Germans had. Next slide. This is the Fokker Eindecker. This is the aircraft that the Germans first started to use, the first aircraft with a synchronized machine gun firing through the propellant. Very deadly, caused a lot of damage until the Newport 11 and another British airplane came along and kind of overtook the Eindecker. What we finally ended up with toward the end of the Lafayette Escadrille and the Lafayette Flying Corps were the SPAD 7s, SPAD 13. This was our most advanced aircraft that we used in that unit. This is a picture of a SPAD 7 with a swastika on it. Now, the swastika was kind of a thing from a couple of thousand years back, a good luck symbol. So this particular SPAD was flown by the legendary Raoul Wolfberry, who we'll be talking about, other gentleman called Didier Mason. And what they did, Lafayette was the only pilot who did shoot down a German airplane using this particular aircraft. What's very interesting is Didier Mason and another Lafayette Escadrille pilot, Edward Parsons, were flyers before they were in the Lafayette Escadrille. They were here in the United States early on, 1912, 1913, and they both flew in the Mexican Revolution on opposite sides. Neither one knew it until they got together in the Escadrille, and I guess they talked about it over coffee. One of the airplanes we competed with was the Albatross D5. We have one of these here in the museum. The Albatross series, D2 through D5, were Albatrosses that the Red Baron flew, and the Red Baron got about 48 or so, give or take, of his kills flying this airplane. And of his 80 kills were flying the D2s through the D5s. This particular one that we have was in the markings of Hans Joachim von Hippel, who survived the war. And in the interwar period, he went on to fly kind of circuses and airlines. Then he served in World War II, flying the old Junkers trimotors, Junkers 52, survived that war, and died an old man after the war. So he kind of lucked out. This airplane is also hanging in our museum. This, of course, is the Fokker DR-1 triplane at which the Red Baron got his last 20 kills in the Fokker triplanes. It was relatively slow, about 103 miles an hour, but it was very, very maneuverable, dangerous aircraft, and flown by the right people. Next. Probably was one of the most formidable aircraft in World War I, the Fokker V7. It'd do about 125 miles an hour, maybe a little bit faster. Our SPAD was a little bit faster, but this was a very dangerous aircraft, and we have this model here hanging in our museum. Next. So where did all of this stuff take place? Where did all these airplanes fly? Well, basically, you had the Western Front, which is right here, and then you had the Eastern Front that went back into Europe and all the way down into Turkey. We're going to talk about where we flew, where most of our flying took place was right around in here in the Western Front. And this, as you can see, is the furthest the Germans got into France. We would fly into these parts of Belgium and Germany on certain missions. Next slide. This is where the bases for the Lafayette Escadrille were located. Now, we had kind of two types of flying. We had the defensive and the offensive flying. Aircraft would fly offensively into just part of the front to look for the Germans. They would also fly defensively to keep the Germans from bombing us or fighting with us in this part of the sector. The flights were usually the SPADs and the Newports. We had the Newports. SPADs and the Newports didn't have a whole lot of endurance. They would do an hour and a half, 2 hours, maybe a little bit longer. So you could go in and you could come out, although some would escort bombers into Belgium and further in to do some of their escort missions. The Lafayette Escadrille was kind of like the brainchild of Lieutenant William Thaw, Sergeant Norman Prince. Dr. Edmund Gross was the guy who was way back. He was a surgeon who was politically connected. He did all the politics. He did all the movement, shaking and moving to get things organized. These two people were basically the people who had the thought of starting the all-American unit, the Lafayette Escadrille. Thaw, he lived to serve in the American Air Service, became a group commander, and he survived the war. Sergeant Norman Prince was killed. He was killed in an accident. The squadron was called the Escadrille Americaine first, but then after a while, the Germans said this doesn't show any kind of neutrality. They complained about it. So they changed the name to the Lafayette Escadrille after the Marquis de Lafayette, who came to help George Washington during the Revolutionary War. They needed a logo, and of course what they came up with was the American Indian design. It was actually taken from an advertisement for Savage rifles. Anybody ever heard of the Savage weapons, Savage rifles from back many years ago? So they took the Indian from the Savage rifles, and they made it, this was the Seminole Indian that they used, Seminole model. Later on, they decided to jazz it up a bit, some of the artists in the squadron, and they made the Sioux Indian. Here again, we see a swastika here on the Indians' earpiece. When these squadrons in the French Air Force were designated, they would designate the squadron by the type of aircraft that was in it. So the Lafayette Escadrille started off with Newports, so it was N-124. When they changed to SPADs, it became SPA 124. Other squadrons were similarly named with the type of aircraft as part of the designation of the squadron. And this would be adopted later on by our 103rd Air Squadron. Next, one of the leading people in the Lafayette Escadrille, and then flying in France in World War I, was Raoul Lufbery. Raoul Lufbery, he had an American father, French mother. Mother died early. Father takes off, goes back to the U.S. Lufbery comes over to the U.S. when he's in his early 20s, lives in Connecticut for a while, joins the Army in San Francisco, goes over to the Philippines, becomes a citizen in the Army there. Then after that, Lufbery goes and he teams up with a person by the name of Mark Porpa, which a lot of people don't hear about, but he's really quite an aviation, he's really quite important in the history of aviation, Mark Porpa. They do a whole bunch of flying around India, Africa, and then in 1914, Lufbery joins the Army as a mechanic, later on becomes a pilot, and eventually joins the Lafayette Escadrille. When the Escadrille goes into the American service, Lufbery transfers to the U.S. Air Service in February 1918. A few months later, he's killed. He's chasing a German two-place aircraft. Nobody really actually knows what happened, but he gets shot up some way. They said in his body that his thumb was shot up. The airplane rolls over and he falls out. Some people say he was trying to fall into a river, but he didn't do that. He landed on a fence in somebody's yard and he was killed. It was a big loss for us, because in the Lafayette Escadrille, they had 33 aircraft that they shot down during the course of the Escadrille's existence. He shot down 16 of them. And because of the French, the way the French needed to confirm their kills, it was so strict. Two people on the ground had to see it. They had to see it in a certain way. A lot of his kills weren't even recorded. If you flew over the German territory, which most of the time we were trying to fly over the German territory, the wind was behind us. So we were at a disadvantage there. When he flew over the German territory, he shot an airplane down. He didn't get credit for it. So they say he might have shot down as many as 50 aircraft. Next. So here he is when he transfers to the U.S. Air Service by a Newport 28. He becomes a major when he comes over to the U.S. Air Service. And here he is with one of his mascots. He had two lions, whiskey and soda. These lions were with the unit until it disbanded. Then those lions went to the French zoo, and unfortunately they didn't survive in the French zoo. But Lufbery is remembered to today quite a bit. Next slide. This is 100th anniversary in Wallingford, Connecticut, where he worked for a while as a youngster. This is his great nephew, Raoul Lufbery III. This is the parade they had for him. They've named buildings in a road and such after Lufbery. So he is quite an icon in the history of World War I aviation. We saw Sergeant Kiffin Yates early on standing with his brother. Here he is here standing by his aircraft. He was the first aircraft to shoot down an enemy, first pilot to shoot down an enemy aircraft in World War I. Later, he was killed in action. So he's another one of the first. We have people here, we've got a lot of firsts coming up with this Lafayette Escadrille. Victor Chapman, first American pilot, he's the first American pilot. So you got the first guy to shoot down an enemy airplane. First guy killed in action, World War I, supposedly, is Victor Chapman. Interesting character. Kind of took a lot of risks. Story is that there was one of the pilots, he was very badly wounded. His stomach was all screwed up. They said they couldn't give him any water. So what they thought they could do is give him a little suck on oranges and such. So they were running out of oranges. So what Chapman did was he said, I'll get you some oranges, even if I have to go to Paris. So he jumped in an airplane and he flies off and he gets the crate of oranges. He's coming on back. Then he sees some of his own guys on a mission and he just can't resist. He gets involved and that's the end of Chapman. And the guy didn't get his oranges. Too bad for that. Next. Now in our museum, we have a Newport 28. The Newport 28 was the aircraft that our American squadrons, when they were formed, first got for about 4 months. Kenneth Marr was a California guy who went to Alaska, worked with sled dogs, joined the Lafayette Escadrille, went through the ambulance corps, went through the Foreign Legion, the whole squash, but he took some dogs over. One of the things he did was he took dogs to the French so they could tow sleds with the wounded in the mountains, the Vosges Mountains. They called him Silors because he was associated with Indians. An Indian came with him when he did it. The Escadrille was assimilated and he became, for a while, the squadron commander of the 94th, and this is his number 6. Afterward, he was relieved of command and he came here and he became head of gunnery at North Island. Then he retired, got into the movies, got into real estate, a whole bunch of other stuff, lived a good life until he passed away. Okay, Eugene Bullard, first African-American fighter pilot. Runs away from home when he's about 17 years old, gets on a boat, goes to England, then to France. He was a boxer, a musician, did all kinds of other kind of labor. He eventually ends up in the Foreign Legion. He's wounded twice. He trains as an observer gunner first when he gets into the aviation unit, and he flies with a SPAD unit for about, I guess, 5 or 8 months. And then what happens is he gets into an altercation with a French officer, and they send him back to the Foreign Legion. So he gets out of it. And so what happens is that he ends the war in the Foreign Legion. He becomes a musician, a nightclub owner, has a family, does a lot of good stuff, joins the army again when the war starts, when the Germans invade France, gets wounded again, then he decides to come back to the United States before we entered the war. He ended up in the regular black milieu of the time. Wasn't as celebrated as he was in France. He was an elevator operator in Radio City. Person's talking to him, finds out his story, and says, "We got to get you on TV." So he ends up going on to the Dave Garroway Today Show, and this is how we found out about Eugene Bullard, by getting a Wilner show. He died a couple of years later, buried in a Foreign Legionnaire uniform, and we finally honored him by posthumously commissioning him as a second lieutenant in 1994 in the U.S. Air Force. Next. Another first, Edmund Genet, really weird. First American killed in combat after officially entering. This is the first guy who was killed after we entered the war. We entered the war on, I forget, something like in April of 1917. 2 days later, he gets killed. So he was officially another first, the first American to be killed in World War I. So we're piling up all these firsts for the Lafayette Escadrille. Next, James Bach. He was one of the first guys to go over in 1914. to join the Foreign Legion, and he became a pilot in July of 1950. That's before we really got into the Lafayette Escadrille. So he's one of the first. Might have been the first pilot in the Lafayette Flying Corps. He was captured by the Germans while trying to insert people in for a minute to blow up some train tracks or something, and the Germans captured it while he was behind the lines. So he served the rest of the war as a POW, and so he became another first American prisoner of war. So we're piloting while he's first, right? Next, we're gonna stop at the first for a while. We're going to talk about the bottle of death, which belonged to Kiffin Rockwell. Kiffin Rockwell was having a drink one day, and they just said, "Why don't you just take this bottle of whiskey, and we'll take a sip every time we shoot down an enemy aircraft." So that's what the bottle of death is all about. If you read about it, about the Lafayette Escadrille. I'm not sure how long it took them to drink it, but I'm sure they got down to the bottom. Next. So in February of 1918, the Lafayette Escadrille transfers to the U.S. Air Service. The unit goes over. It's designated the 103rd Aero Squadron. We have the logo. It adopts the logo. All the pilots, now back, the French, and they used to have, when you became a pilot in France, you started out as a corporal. Then you became a sergeant. Then there was another rank called adjutant, which is kind of like a warrant officer. But anyway, most of the pilots that flew were enlisted rank. When they joined the U.S. Air Force, they were all, U.S. Air Service, they were all given a rank, officer rank, all commissioned. Oh, I meant to say that some people, when we transitioned over, chose to stay with the French, the Lafayette Flying Corps. Some people did that. They were still commissioned as U.S. officers. They kept that commission when they were in the French, Air Service. Now, this book says there are 269 members in the Lafayette Escadrille. And what this book did, there's a book right here, pretty good book. What it did was it took all 269 people who joined the Lafayette Escadrille, the Lafayette Flying Corps, for training. Not all of them finished. So all of those 269, a number of them didn't make it through for one reason or the other. So the real number of people who actually flew combat goes back and forth between 180, 200, whatever it is. Doesn't make any difference. Still, the history that we looked at is what's the interesting part of it. And so what I've done here is I've shown that 268, 38 were in the Escadrille. Of the 199 aircraft shot down, which is probably a small number, because as I said, the French verification system, the number could be twice that many. Who would know? Shooting down the aircraft. So they shot down 33 with the Escadrille, 13 aces, counted for 110. Escadrille did 42. 69 Lafayette Flying Corps people died, 42 in action. Escadrille lost 11. 15 became prisoners of war. The Escadrille had 3. Next. Escadrille is not forgotten, nor the Americans forgotten. In France, if you go to France as a tourist and you go to the Arc de Triomphe, half a mile south of the Arc de Triomphe is the memorial to the American volunteers in the Place des États-Unis in Paris, American place in Paris. The statue was modeled after the poet Alan Seeger. Alan Seeger was a poet who wrote, "I Have a Rendezvous with Death." And for people who are old enough to remember, Alan Seeger was Pete Seeger's uncle, folk singer Pete Seeger's uncle. He was killed in July 4th, 1916. He's quite remembered in France. When the French president came to the United States to address Congress, he mentioned Alan Seeger. There is a memorial to the Lafayette Escadrille. It's in France. It's near outside of Paris. There are about 60-some crypts. Not all of them are filled. Some of the people have chosen haven't been found or have moved on. The Norman Prince, one of the Lafayette Escadrille people, is buried in the Washington Cathedral. And Kiffin Rockwell, the guy that shoot down the first German aircraft, is interred in Washington Lee University. Next, the Escadrille still lives. Right after the war, several years after the war, they said, let's have a unit that, commemorates the Lafayette Escadrille. So they started Fighter Squadron 2/4 Lafayette in the French. And here today, well, this is a couple of years ago, here's a Dassault Mirage. You can see that the chief is still there flying with the French in the latest version of the Lafayette Escadrille in France. My next speaker will be Ron Carrico, who will be talking about the American Volunteer Group, which we know as the Flying Tigers.
Okay, my name is Ron Carrico again, and I'm here to talk about the AVG and the 23rd Fighter Group, which is also known as the Flying Tigers, between the two of them. We have a major exhibit in our museum, and this is it. Next slide, please. And this is the symbol of the Flying Tigers. This was designed by the Disney Corporation shortly after they started the Flying Tigers. Next. The Flying Tigers are made of the American Volunteer Group, often referred to as the AVG, and the 23rd Fighter Group. The AVG, basically for about 6 to 7 months, they were in combat, and after that, it was taken over by the 23rd Fighter Group, and they flew for 17 to 18 months. We'll go on from that. Next slide. The World War situation at the time. China had been invaded by the Japanese in 1937, 1938, and they were sweeping down, taking over more and more countries as they went. The reason why primarily is they needed petroleum products and they needed rubber products, and so they were taking over this land. We saw early on that something had to be done about it, and so President Roosevelt decided to get involved in the war, and this was the map of the area at the time. They primarily flew out of Kunming and Rangoon, which is where they put the airplanes together. And the idea was to protect not only the Burma Road, but also the various and sundry places they had in southern China. And they actually flew down into the Gulf of Tonkin, we might know that word from, and to the Hanoi area. They were doing, they operated from 41, 42. Again, American Volunteer Group, AVG. Really, they were civilians. They were pilots from the United States Air Force, Army Air Corps, Navy, and Marines, and they're commanded by General Chenault. Next slide. They flew the P-40 A, Bs, and Cs, and they upgraded to the P-40E at a certain time. The P-40E had 6 50 caliber machine guns, 3 at each wing, and 2 on the nose. Plus, they added the center fuel tank or a 1,000-pound bomb. Tactics were taught by Colonel Chenault. The idea of the Flying Tigers was it was going to give hope, because this was the first time we had engaged the Japanese after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Next slide. The command was General Chiang Kai-shek, his wife, Madame Chang, Mr. Chenault, or General Chenault. Chenault was actually a captain and retired from the U.S. Army Air Corps, and he was a pilot. Next slide, please. It was a covert operation. Chenault had been hired by the Chinese to instruct, and at the same time, he actually flew combat missions against the Chinese, so he knew their capabilities. They created a covert company, well, not covert company, but a covert operation. It was hide under CAMCO, was Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company. They were authorized by Roosevelt to hire 100 pilots and get 100 airplanes. The P-40 was selected. A guy named Skip Adair was the principal recruiter. He traveled around to Army and Navy and Marine bases, and he eventually had 100 pilots. Actually, not all of them served. A lot of them didn't actually qualify. Some of them were transport pilots, so they just couldn't fly fighter aircraft. There were 60 Navy and Marines and 40 from the U.S. Army. Next slide. This is General Chenault. Started out, here he is, as a pilot in the 30s. He flew with a group called the Flying Trapeze, so he was a very accomplished airman. He One thing that's interesting to note here is the Chinese wings. It has the Chinese star in the middle, and he flew. This is actually a picture taken later on. He was a colonel to start off with. Here he is briefing some of the boys, or being briefed by them. And you notice this is a P-51. So this is what the 23rd Fighter do. Notice the Tiger Shark does not look quite as cool on a P-51 as it does on a P-40. And here's another picture of Chanel. They called him Old Leatherface for obvious reasons. He was a constant smoker, so that's probably what did it. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the P-40 in our museum. We had one for a very long time. This is the Squadron patch. These were largely made up. Each one of the guys had something different. Sometimes they were just painted onto their uniforms or their flight jacket. But the P-40s, they actually received 99 to start off with. The first 33 went to, first numbers 33 went to the first pursuit squadron. 34, 30, 37 went to the next squadron, which was called the Panda Bears, and the last group went to the Hells Angels. This one was in our museum for many, many years, as you can see it. And I don't know, it was about 5 or 6 years ago. The owner of the airplane, who I think was the fellow who had owned the Flying Tigers airline. And the story goes that when Flying Tigers was bought out by FedEx, they received all these huge airplanes, and there was that one little one there amongst them. It's like, well, anyway, he kept it. It's in Hawaii now. Next slide. Mission: destroy Japanese bombers and fighters that were attacking the Chinese military bases. Next slide. These are some of the pilots here. I want you to notice a little bit. The next time you go to our museum or downstairs, take a look at the mural. I meant to point this out earlier, but the mural, you have a P-40 claiming, and then way above you have some bombers, and that's because that was a very accurate representation. By the way, the mural was done in 1986 by a New Zealand gentleman by the name of Petach. I tried to contact him. Apparently he's not alive anymore. But the first time they got into combat was in December the 20th, 1941, or about 2 weeks after the raid on Pearl Harbor. And they've been in place for a few months. They started men slowly coming in and training. And then there was an attack on Kunming, and they went up and they shot down at least 6. The British also shot down several British Chinese airplanes next. Now, the British were there. Of course, this was a British area at that time. And so the airplanes they had was a Hurricane, if you prefer. The Brister Buffalo, a very handsome airplane, and the Blenheim Bomber. A lot of the missions that the AVG flew was to provide cover for the Blenheim Bombers on the various and sundry raids they made. Next slide. The Japanese had pretty inferior airplanes for the time. They had the I-96, the I-97, the Ki-45, the twin engine, and the only bomber they had at the time was the Sally. Later on, towards the end of the war, they had the Japanese Zero, and they had the Betty. Okay, next slide, please. This again is this is actually off of the jacket of Charles Bond, which is downstairs in the display case. Again, they had about 100 pilots. They had to resign their commissions and enter as civilians. They were paid between $600 and $675 a month. This is the AVG. And plus, you got $500 for every Japanese airplane that was shot down. Charles Bond said that really helped him buy a house for his parents back in Texas. This word here, I'm not sure what that says. Feihu, okay, which is it's a Chinese word for tiger shark, apparently. There's a question about where the term came from, about the flying tigers. Some people, it's because it's tiger shark in Japanese, or in Chinese, I should say. But some people say it came because the editor of Time magazine, one of the articles they wrote about these tigers that were flying in China to protect the Chinese. So, therefore, the flying tigers. Charles Bond was the first guy to add the shark's teeth to the P-40. We have an exhibit downstairs with Charles Bond, who became a major general. The next slide. And this was the first pursuit squadron. Again, this is leather. This is in our display case. It's called the Adam and Eves. A lucky pilot there. Probably had too much to drink. Next one's the Panda Bear. Sadly, the guy that designed that logo was killed in action, so didn't survive the war. Next, and that's the Hells Angels. This is my favorite. It's the third pursuit squadron, and the pursuit squadron name changed to the fighter squadron later on. Next slide, please. There were 100 airplanes that were shipped to Rangoon over a period of time, from early to probably from April on till, December, September, and they put the airplanes together in Rangoon. One of them was dropped into the water. They used it for parts later on. The P-40 had some advantages over the Japanese airplanes. It was fast going down. We're talking 230, 240, maybe 275 in a dive. It had pilot head armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Initially, they only had the four 30 calibers. Unfortunately, they were mounted on their side, and they would jam a lot of times. And so the guys had to rely on the two 50 calibers in front. No gun sight on delivery, oddly enough, if you can believe that. They put a ring gun sight on the airplane. As a side note here, a lot of the guys who became aces were old country boys, so we're used to shooting things in the air, and you got the idea of how to lead and that sort of thing. You see that a lot in World War II, World War I pilots. They subsequently equipped a better gun sight and radio. The radio didn't work with the dam apparently, but they had the radio at any rate. I thought this was really interesting. Chenault, because the boys needed some help, he bought 100 pairs of Bosch & Lomb Ray-Ban sunglasses. So what do you see the Top Gun guys wearing? Ray-Ban sunglasses. One thing that was more significant than anything else is they had a vast warning net. Next slide, please. They had Chinese civilians all over the place that were tracking, and they would hear or see airplanes. They would radio or call in to say to a headquarters, probably it's Kunming, to tell where they had seen them and when. So they would track this and try and figure out where the Japanese were going so they could intercept them. Although the primary place was Kunming, there was actually most of the incidents that were combat were out of Rangoon early on. Oddly enough, they had to scramble to intercept attacks on their own base. So the Japanese had a tendency to fly at night. They love flying at night, get the engines quietly sort of out of sync, so you get that Doppler wah wah wah, which kept the pilots awake all night. Of course, quite often they didn't have trouble sleeping because they had, had a lot of adult refreshments that night. The Japanese aircraft, no armor for the pilots, no self-sealing fuel tanks, pretty slow compared to the P-40, but very maneuverable. And the tactics that were taught were, don't get into a turning fight with the Japanese airplane. Charles Bond discovered that the split S was a good way to get out of it, meaning it's like an S upside down. And he'd come out the bottom about 400 knots. So this was a really good way to get the Japanese off your tail. The idea was strike, go, turn around, come back. So the Tiger Shark was actually, the RAF used it. In Africa, and the Germans used it as well. It is pretty cool. Next slide. Tactics taught by, coming high, preferably out of the sun, and then the split S to escape. The Japanese had a weird way of protecting their bombers. The fighters flew in back of the bombers, which no one ever quite understood why we were doing that way, but they said they could attack the bombers first. And they mostly shot down bombers. Next slide. Some of the significant pilots, Tex Hill, his name is prominently on that leather jacket we have downstairs. If you look at the jacket, you'll see signatures by a lot of the guys. When we had the P-40, there were several reunions held here at our museum. I think that's where most of that stuff came from. Donald Rossi was the guy that brought in most of the stuff for the museum. But they had all the Tiger pilots sign the horizontal stabilizer. I saw there was maybe 25 or 30 signatures. That display is mostly about the AVG. And I'll show you a little bit more here. So here's David Hill, Tex Hill, and here he is with the P-51. Charles Holder, interesting guy. I think he had like 16 victories. He had a lot. He was very productive. And here he is later in life, Judge Charles O. Charles Manson trial, he's the guy that sentenced him and heard the trial. And I think this is him in front of number 68. I think that was the airplane he was assigned to. Next slide. Other pilots, Rossi, who's the guy that we owe our Exhibit 2 downstairs. R.T. Smith, you see a lot of pictures of R.T. Smith. I don't know why he was a real camel hog. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, here we are with General Charles Bond. He's got an excellent book about the AVG. The selfie there, kind of interesting. And here he is as a Major General. Next slide, please. He sort of became the scheduling officer. Apparently, these were a wild bunch of guys. They frankly didn't like it very much. They really wanted out of there after they got involved in the war. So the end of the contract, Camco contract comes up July 4th. Most of the guys were happy to leave. A few guys stayed behind to fly with the CNAC. Fly in a hump. There were only 28 P-40s left that were in flyable condition. They'd been badly shot up, not to mention crashed. A lot of the guys were crashed in training, spun in, things like that. They said 25 pilots stayed behind to train the incoming 23rd pilots. I don't know if that's true or not. All the numbers change. 5 pilots stayed behind with the 23rd. Sadly, this fellow here, John Petach, was stayed behind to fly a few more missions, and he signed up for another 10 days. And sadly, he was killed on July the 10th. The airplane exploded in the air. They never knew what happened. Unfortunately, he was married to a nurse, Red Foster, and she was pregnant when he went down. When she came home after, they left in July of 42, she was escorted by Charles Bond back to her house. Next slide. There were about 68 pilots who flew combat, and then AVG and CNAC pilot Robert Prescott founded the Flying Tigers in the Air Freight Service, right after the war. 29 pilots became ace status. Pappy Boynton, the famous Pappy Boynton, he left in April 42. They never have figured out why, but one thing I figured out for sure is he really liked to drink a lot. He joined the AVG in the first place to make money because he was really in trouble financially. He was built like a bull, apparently, and he loved to fight. That's probably why he left in the first place. Next slide. Recently, a P-40 was taken out of a lake near Kunming, the Lake Dorigan. And this fellow, John Blackburn, was one of the people that was one of the instructor pilots they had. He went into the water in 1942 and subsequently found it. They went to try and find it. 2 weeks later, they found the thing not very deep in the lake. His body was still in it, and they pulled him out of it. He died apparently. I think he's probably landed safely, and I think he got trapped in the rudder pedals and couldn't get out and drown. But this thing has been recovered, and I'm sure somewhere it's being recovered or restored right now. It'd be great if we had it downstairs. Next slide. Problems. Living conditions were terrible. I mean, it was horrible conditions, horrible weather, even at the best of locations. The food was poor. Alcohol was plentiful. And there were nightly overflights by the Japanese. Charles Bond took over pilot scheduling. The pilots did not like strafing. It's simply too dangerous. When you have a radiator underneath the airplane, one magic BB and you're going down. There were many accidents, many pilots killed. Frankly, a lot of the guys just wanted to go home, to get out of China, come back to the United States. Next slide. 23rd Pursuit Group comes in July 1942. Their mission was to defend the Vienna bases and protect the Burma Road. The Japanese forces were advancing on all fronts. And the idea was to protect the treacherous mountain roads in southern Himalayas. They were made part of the 20 China Air Task Force, and Paul's going to cover the CNAC in a few minutes here. Next slide. The 23rd Fighter Group, the name has survived. It was started with, a small group, and then it grew, and throughout they were assisted by the 51st Fighter Squadron. Next slide. One of the most significant of the pilots that was involved was David Lopes. And you see our models we have downstairs. Tony Barris's models are on display. One of them is Lopes Hope. This guy's a really interesting guy. We have 2 books that he wrote. He's subsequently a director of the Smithsonian and he quite often came to these events. Oddly enough, the AVG pilots who put these things together didn't consider him an AVG guy because he was sort of like kind of real flying tiger. Well, obviously he was a real flying tiger because they adopted the group name. The Army Air Corps adopted the Flying Tigers to continue on the name. Next slide. So there were 3 squadrons of the 74th, 75th, and 76th squadrons. And then this was the wing patch they had, the Flying Tiger coming out, attacking the Japanese. These sort of stand for what they look like. And today, the squadron patches are pretty much the same. We have General Chanel, Colonel Scott. Colonel Scott was initially there to lead the flights over the hump, the transport flights. He flew a few of those, but mainly he borrowed a P-50, he borrowed a P-40, and he was the fellow who wrote God Is My Co-Pilot, which is a really good book. And he was like a one-man Air Force. He was out there almost every day flying and attacking the Japanese positions. Then we have Tex Hill, and Ed Rector, who's mentioned downstairs. He became a general. Tex Hill became a major general after the war with the Air National Guard. Next slide. The first P-51s arrived in November of 1943. And like I said earlier, they flew for 17 months, the 23rd. The 23rd version of the Flying Tigers flew almost 3 times as long in combat as the original ABG. Next slide. Here's Dave Lopes. We talk about here, Smithsonian Director, Colonel Scott. He lived until 2006, became a general. Bruce Holloway, this gentleman here, became a general. This is Holloway here at the end. And I guess this must be all the Lopes in front of the end here. And this airplane is hanging in the Smithsonian. I think when you walk in and you're upstairs, it's just hanging right there. Next slide. Here's Ed Rector again, some of the pilots again. There's Tex Hill, R.T. Smith, and you might recognize this little statue. There were numerous pictures where he was the gunfighter. I don't know if he had a helmet on and whatever that was that they used as a flight suit. Next slide. Mission and compliments. They were finally forced to leave. I got December 45. It's not right. It was December 44. The Japanese were coming down and down and down. You might say this is the one front where the United States didn't do as well as they could have. And the 23rd was considered to be the largest contributor to the Allied victory. And they're flying the 40s and the P-51s. They were basically doing a lot of strafing and bombing the Japanese installations. They went as far as Taiwan with the P-51. I think they had a 16 ship that attacked Taiwan at one point. Next slide. Scorecard. 621 Japanese aircraft destroyed in the air, most by the Army Air Corps unit. 90 destroyed on the ground, 110 shot down, 30, and there's different numbers again, 32 to 47 recorded A status. And now the 23rd has been honored by the use of the wing name and all the numbers to the present day. Next slide. These are the list of airplanes that the 23rd, which still exists, has flown. P-40s, 51s, 47s, F-80s, 86s, 89s, and on down. F-16s. Next slide. And today, Flying Tigers fly A-10s out of Moody Air Force Base, and they have 2 of them are active duty squadrons and 1 is a reserve squadron. And again, the same principal idea. Next slide. The present-day wing patch, Flying Tiger. Next slide. 74th Squadron, 75th Squadron, Thunder Shark with guns, and then this actually in Chinese essentially means vanguards. And this is what it says here. Next slide. And next will be Paul Trevison. He's going to discuss the CNAC, the Chinese National Aviation Corporation. As you've just seen this speaker series from the San Diego Air and Space Museum, talked about the link between American volunteers and sacrifice by American pilots to other Allied countries during World War I and World War II. The first section was covering the Lafayette Escadrille, the Lafayette Flying Corps, and the American Volunteer Group. Chuck Dorigan did World War I, Lafayette Escadrille and Flying Corps. I covered the Flying Tigers and the 23rd Fighter Group, also known as the Flying Tigers. I hope you enjoyed our presentation, and thank you very much.